Welcome to Casual Politics, Lord Strathclyde. Thank you very much for accepting my request. Actually, you're quite well known to the world of politics. You've been here for over 30 years. Your both father and grandfather, they served under Winston Churchill in the 1940s and 1950s. So when you first entered into the Lords back in 1986, I suppose that you were very excited and it was a very exhilarating time for you. So do you still get that excitement when you go there nowadays and sit on those red benches?
Oh, well, it certainly was very exhilarating. I was very young. I was 26 when I took my seat in the House of Lords. You're right. I had a job in the City of London. So I only came here in the evenings, but exhilarating is exactly the right word. There was a lot going on. It was Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister. As to your question, do I still feel that same sense of exhilaration? Yes, I do, very much. This is an extraordinary building. Over the last 180 years, so much has happened within it, and it. If a building can have a spirit, then this one exudes a spirit of those that came before us. And it is a very exciting atmosphere, very exciting environment in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, encased in one building. So yes, I find it very exhilarating and I take nothing for granted.
And as both your father and grandfather, they both under Churchill and Macmillan, did you ever, as a child, come across some great figures back in the days and had meetings with them which struck you as a child?
Well, Winston Churchill died when I was 5, so I can't say that.
But
later on in the 1970s, I met Alec Douglas-Home, who had been Prime Minister in the 1960s. He then was Foreign Secretary in the 1970s. And Ted Heath, who was Prime Minister. And many other people like Fitzroy Maclean, who was a great Scottish politician. And many of these Scottish Secretaries of State, later on people like George Younger. And I've had a fascinating career. I've met all sorts of people. And of course, between 1988 and 1997, I was a minister, first in Margaret Thatcher's government and secondly in John Major's government. And I met people, travelled to places, travelled all over the United Kingdom, meeting all kinds of different people. And I think that is part of the experience that politicians have. MPs have it even better because they have constituencies. They have a direct link with what people think in the constituency where they come from. It's different from members of the House of Lords. We don't represent an area, we don't represent anybody, we represent ourselves. But we have a responsibility to find out what is happening so that can help direct our thoughts, our consciences, and even our voting.
And had you ever fancied to go and fight an election to become an MP?
I considered it very briefly. I'd fought in a European election in 1984 when I was 24. So I had considered it, but I'm glad I didn't make that decision. There have been periods in my life when I thought, gosh, being an MP would be a fantastic thing, and it's an extraordinary job to do. It's a much harder job than I think people appreciate. And one of the great things about being a member of the House of Lords, or indeed being a minister as a member of the House of Lords, is you probably see MPs more closely than anybody else, working away, balancing different competing interests, their constituency, their party, their ministerial work. And they do an extraordinary job.
And following the passing of your grandfather, you succeeded him in his seat in the Lords. When you became a hereditary peer, does that make you special in the House of Lords?
No, not at all. Everybody here is an equal, a peer. That's where the word comes from. And on my first day here, I had a cup of tea with the then Duke of Norfolk, who was obviously very grand and very distinguished, and a former Secretary of State for Scotland. They themselves were very different, but we were all together doing the same thing. So no, there is no sense of specialness at all, except all of us in the House of Lords feel very privileged to be part of the legislature in this rather extraordinary constitutional arrangement that we have.
And 1998, I suppose it's a very special time in your career, because as the leader of the opposition, you had to negotiate with the government to allow 92 peers to sit in the Lords when Tony Blair decided to abolish the hereditary peerage. So how challenging was it for you to negotiate those terms? First with your party, because I believe that there were some people who weren't on the same side as you, and then with the government.
Well, it was a very difficult time, as you can imagine. It was very testing, challenging. The House of Lords does have some influence. It has a lot of power, which in practice it doesn't use very much. And up until 1998, 1999, 2/3 of it were made up of hereditary peers, and Tony Blair came in a great modernising agenda and wanted to scrap them. But he didn't have any idea how he wanted to replace them. And that was the point, and he said he wanted to make it more democratic. And
did he wanted to get rid of them? Or?
He just wanted to get rid of them. He wanted to remove one group of people and replace them with another group of people.
By his cronies.
As the phrase was coined, Tony's cronies. So it was complicated. My predecessor, who was then Lord Cranborne, who was the leader of the House and then the leader of the opposition, he resigned, and he and William Hague, who was then the leader of the Conservative Party, had a disagreement. Actually, these were two honourable men trying to reach a solution and not being able to agree about it. One of them had to step back, and it was my very good friend Robert Cranborne who did so. I then became leader of the opposition to finish off the deal that he had organised, which allowed us to maintain a small part of the ancient constitution, the hereditary constitution, in part to see through the long-term reforms to this House. That's nearly 20 years ago, and we still haven't got any further. But it shows how right he was not to trust a government when it said it wanted to have another democratic reform.
We even haven't moved forward since 1958. We're still debating about the life periods, about the Prime Minister's cronies. And then Margaret Thatcher actually was the only living Conservative Prime Minister at the time. What were her views on this? Because we're not quite familiar to what her role was.
Well, in the House of Lords.
Yes, when you were fighting for 92
but she was very supportive.
Peers to remain.
Margaret Thatcher was very supportive of everything we did. She was a supporter of the Conservative Party. She was an extraordinary figure. She became, when she stood down from Prime Minister, she stood down from the House of Commons, she came to the House of Lords, became one of our backbenchers, and she was a loyalist, and quite rightly, and I think she was a bit shocked by what had happened and by Mr. Blair's great reforms, some of which looked unthought of, not fully thought through. Nobody quite knew what they were going to end. And look, the House of Lords is unfinished business. Scottish devolution, great fanfare, and now we're looking at breaking up the United Kingdom. All the implications of these decisions hadn't been fully thought through. And Lady Thatcher, as she then was, as somebody who balanced change with tradition, I think would have been quite offended by what has happened.
And back in 2010, you became eventually a cabinet minister in the Lords. How challenging was that again to run a party in the Lords, which slightly started to lose its majority and to not have
well,
majority?
Being in the cabinet is difficult for anybody. It doesn't matter what post you have. These are all difficult jobs, and people would expect them to be difficult. For us, as an incoming, it was a coalition government, so we had Conservatives and Liberals in the House of Lords, which made it slightly easier, but there were occasional difficulties that we had to overcome.
It was your grandfather before you had served in a coalition.
Indeed.
Took over from him.
And also, and then after 2015, when the Conservative Party won a majority in the House of Commons, but for the first time ever, the Conservative Party did not control the House of Lords. And in the modern era, in the last couple of years, this has been very testing in the House of Lords. And the opposition have been sort of feeling their way as to what the limits of their power are. The Conservative Party is trying to manage it. And I think people are beginning to realise that having a second chamber is a very useful and very good thing to allow the House of Commons to think again. But because it is unelected, because it is unrepresentative, it shouldn't have the ultimate power to block things from the second chamber, particularly when they have been part of the winning party's manifesto.
But Lord Fax, who wants to make it more representative across the region in England, so have you supported his?
No, Lord Fax wants to abolish the second chamber. He sees no room for it, and so he nitpicks at these little areas. I come from Scotland, as he does, and but neither he nor I represent the people of Scotland, or indeed the people that we live from. He of course is quite right that we need people from all across the United Kingdom, but his motivation is about abolition. It is not about improvement.
And in those 3 episode programme produced by the BBC, and you took part in those episodes as well, Lord Tyler, a Lib Dem peer, he has said before that House of Lords it's the best elderly care home in the country. Do you agree with him?
Well, I think he was perhaps being slightly tongue-in-cheek or ironic, which doesn't always come across.
But the average age is quite high, isn't it? It's
the average
above
age,
75.
It's about 70. The average age of the House of Lords is about, I certainly bring it down. And I did, when I first came here, I was one of the youngest members. I'm not now one of the youngest members, but I'm still way below the average of.
Lord Camden is the oldest.
He certainly is, and a very distinguished member.
Yeah.
In a nation which is getting older, I don't think it's completely out of line to have somewhere within your political establishment a place where older people can contribute, play a part in, and lend their experience and knowledge, with some younger people as well. So I'm not opposed to younger people, older people being members of the House of Lords. The real long-term question for this second chamber is, in order to make it representative, in order to give it authority, I think in the 21st century, you need it to be elected.
Half elected or fully elected?
No, I would have 80% elected, and then the 20% would be made up of the independent crossbenchers. People who
But we already have an independent chamber, so we're going back to the 1950s when we wanted to...
We haven't. I mean, the House of Lords has a large independent.
Do you mean a federal chamber?
Well, that's another question altogether. I mean, as a first step, I would seek to try and find a way of electing people to the second chamber, to the House of Lords, on different constituencies, larger constituencies, and only 80%. I think you've got to preserve 20% for people who have no particular involvement in politics, so former civil servants, ambassadors, trades unionists, even people who want to be something else other than political representatives. On the question of having a more federal United Kingdom, I think that really is an interesting question. And there are people who are looking as to how we could develop that, to have a second chamber which becomes a second chamber for all of the United Kingdom, and effectively the House of Commons becomes a chamber, a parliament for England and the English regions. But we are a long way from that. I mean, these are interesting ideas, part of which will be given some push, some momentum because of what's happening in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, in Wales, and in the English regions, and of course the debate about Brexit.
And what about the size? Over 850 peers.
Yeah.
It's the longest second chamber after the Chinese one.
I'm less worried about the size. For very few people, this is their full-time job. For me, for many years, it was the job I did. I came here and I sat on the Conservative benches until 2013. Now I don't. I have other jobs that I do, and I come in when I can to lend my support, to play my part. And that is what most of the House is like. It's not full-time, it's part-time. So inevitably you need more people. I think people worry too much about the size of the House. I think if you asked most people and most of our audience here, what do they think the size of the House of Lords is, I think most of them wouldn't have the faintest idea.
And in 2015, the government, they faced their largest defeat since 1909, when Lord George got defeated because of the People's Budget. And then we had the 1911 Parliamentary Act to reduce the authority of the second chamber. And then David Cameron, he asked you to commission a report in which you would set out the reforms of the second chamber, but it seems that you haven't been very successful because the government faced again another defeat, or like another last week over the Brexit issue and allowing the EU nationals to stay in the UK. So what are your views on that?
Well, that period of history, now well over 100 years ago, 1910, 11, 12, absolutely fascinating in terms of parliamentary history, because the House of Lords tried to use its authority in a way that the House of Commons fundamentally disagreed with and were slapped down, and they had powers removed from them. There's a very valuable lesson for today's House of Lords in that. Don't overstep the mark. You know that. What is the House of Lords for? It's to revise, to scrutinise, to debate the great issues of the day, but it isn't necessarily there to block the House of Commons.
Sorry to interrupt you, but what if we have a very weak opposition in the Commons? Don't you think that it's up, you said it in that programme, that don't you think that it's up to the Lords and the opposition in the Lords to take the government into account?
Well, I do think that there is a very clear and strong role for the House of Lords to scrutinise and to send back to the House of Commons to get them to think again. The danger and the lesson of 1910, 11 and today is that the House of Lords can be strong when it has the people on their side against the House of Commons. And it's picking the right battles to have at the right time, which is so important and so valuable. Now, moving on to the reforms I was looking at the request of David Cameron, I was looking at something quite specific to do with secondary legislation, which is a sort of fast-track way of legislating. The current government have decided not to progress those changes, in part because I think they feel that the time is not right to do them. So we will wait and see. But also, your point about Brexit is really an excellent one about how the House of Lords works. The House of Lords defeated the government on two really important amendments.
Meaningful vote.
Meaningful vote, EU nationals, sent it back to the House of Commons. The House of Commons voted again to insist on their original bill, and on the second time round, the House of Lords quite rightly debated them again and then said, okay, we've asked you to think again, you've decided not to accept our great wisdom, we will leave it at that, and the bill was passed in its original form. That's a very good way for the House of Lords to operate. It's a good test of government resolve and the resolve of individual MPs in the House of Commons, and we came to the solution that was desirable to the people who voted in the referendum and to the Prime Minister and the rest of the government.
Well, that's what you're saying now, but last week in the chamber you spoke against those peers who wanted to vote against the government bill. So
no, of course.
Did you change your mind since last week?
No. Within the chamber, I argued against what the House of Lords did. That's absolutely correct. But the House of Lords, having done that, I will defend the right of the House of Lords to fulfil its constitutional role in asking the House of Commons to think again. So that's entirely consistent.
And now the government, they're facing a lot of challenges over the Scottish issue. As a Scot, do you feel that you've been threatened by the Scottish nationalists over Brexit?
I don't feel threatened, but I think that Scotland is being
They're exploiting this.
Yes, the Scottish Nationalist Party are demonstrating that they have become the anti-Scottish party. They've got their own agenda, which is to cause confusion. And Scotland is the loser of all these ghastly debates. People of the United Kingdom and voted in favour of Brexit, and whether we like it or not, we need to go down that process. In Scotland, there was a referendum only 2.5 years ago, which said very loudly no to separation. We should honour and respect that decision. Mrs. Sturgeon is not doing so, and is trying to sow some confusion about the role of Brexit within that. It's not that we should ignore her or the Scottish Parliament. It'd be much better for Mrs. Sturgeon to work constructively with the UK Parliament and the UK government to get an agreement with Europe which is fair to Europe and fair to all parts of the United Kingdom.
The government reneged again on the budget amendment, which was the national insurance tax. Do you think
they changed their mind?
They changed their mind like 2 years ago. But do you think that this is the party which works for the working class? Because it seems that they slightly becoming very disconnected from the lives of ordinary people.
Yeah, I think that tax, particularly national insurance, is quite complicated. Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, made an announcement in his budget.
It wasn't
against what?
Yeah, against your manifesto.
Some believed it was against what we'd said in our manifesto. Today, he has changed his mind, and he has scrapped his increase.
Can he survive as a Chancellor?
Oh, very much so. He's a very capable individual. And this was, I'm sure he would admit himself, that perhaps he could have handled this better, presented it better, explained more what he was doing and why he was doing it and why it was necessary. But he's pulled back from it, which is a good thing. There needs to be a debate about taxation in this country, about income tax, about national insurance, and about rewarding people who work, the very working class people that you were talking about. And that is an important debate that will continue.
And what's the role for the Lords in the post-Brexit deal negotiations?
What is the role for the House of Lords? Well, the House of Lords
and the role that you will eventually play as one of its players.
The House of Lords was here long before we joined the European Union. This process is going to take a long time. There will always be, I think, a role for a second chamber. I think we improve legislation, individual bits of legislation. We are a good resource that complements the House of Commons and the work of government. There are many distinguished people here, not from the world of politics, but from the world of business, from academia, from all sorts of things. And we should encourage those people to play their part in the House of Lords in the way that they do. And
now that it is time for its restoration, and it's quite very costly, do you think that you have to stay here in this building, or would you mind they just move you out?
I would love to stay here. This building is 180 years old. There are things going wrong with it. And the view is that we all have to, in order to make it of best value to the taxpayer, 'cause it's going to cost a lot of money, the best thing is to move everybody out, do the work, and then put everybody back in. Some of us, me included, fear that we will lose a lot of the essence of the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Some of the things that make it work. Sometimes some of the things that people think make it look a little bit old-fashioned, a bit quirky, full of customs and traditions. But those things which root us in a process of the last 180 years or so, or even beyond that, it's quite good for politicians to be reminded of what came before them. And it doesn't stop this Parliament from actually being very radical and making the important changes for the future.
And lastly, my final question. Tony Benn said that I was once a national threat and now I'm a national treasure. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, certainly not a national threat, and I don't think I have the experience and knowledge to be a national treasure ever. But look, I've had a wonderful career in the House of Lords. In my terms, I've had an extraordinarily privileged time, and I feel it's not over yet.
We shall wait and see on that then. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.